Hey everyone, it's Frodan here. I'm currently on my way traveling to the Las Vegas opening happening December 7th and 9th, and so I apologize for the quality of this video. It's lower production than usual. I'm on my laptop and a headset. But that's not going to stop me from delivering you what I think to be are the best performing comps currently on the 1324 patch. Also, you might be asking, like, is there a guide for any of these comps I'm talking about? You can always head over to Mobalytics/TFT and check out our meta tier list where me and a team of challenger players from China and EUS and North America are all maintaining it at all times. And so there's going to be information that's updated on that website that might even be fresher than this video.
Before we start, I want to give a shout out to my sponsor, Mobalytics, who is helping bring you guys this video. Mobalytics is a dedicated data website to help you find the analysis and edge you need to climb. Check out their stuff at mobalytics.gg/TFT, where you can find compositions by myself, Dishsoap, and many other top players in North America. By downloading their overlay, you can get meta comps in-game, as well as look at different community comps and my own compositions I'm using to climb. It's also the overlay that I use that recommends me real-time data of augments, as well as other information happening in the lobby, so that I can stay up to date. Download the app so you can get your best comps in-game with the Mobalytics overlay.
All right, starting off with the top, the S tier. It's so funny that I talked about this comp, Yone Crowd Diver, last video, saying that it was underplayed and, you know, it's taking over China, whatever, and now it's actually a really popular top of the meta comp. And that's largely because Yone got buffed from that stage. So he was already gaining popularity, and then now you give him a buff, lo and behold, he's on top. Yone Crowd Diver is really powerful because of two things in particular. One, the Crowd Diver board is really powerful because it has so much bonus damage, and it's really strong. And two, you get to play things like Heartsteel naturally in the early game, so you can ramp up those rewards and get to rerolling as soon as you can. The main downside of this composition is that you might get contested, and also that some people are holding Yones for random Heartsteel mid games in their boards. The item guide here on Mobalytics says that you want to try to go for like a BT Titans +1, and in this case they have Giant Slayer, but I highly recommend Quicksilver instead. This is because there's a lot of frontline CC that can really get in your way. So if there's like an Echo or like a Thresh, they really stop Yone in his tracks, and then he can't actually get going. So in this case, the Giant Slayer is actually really nice to get that bonus damage, but you already have a lot of bonus damage from Crowd Diver, so just keep that in mind. Quicksilver is probably the best third item on top of the Bloodthirster and Titan. That being said, I also think Titans is not necessarily as good as it used to be, largely because Yone just wants to actually deal a lot more damage. So if you want to go for Bloodthirster and Giant Slayer and then Quicksilver, I think that's okay. Either way, a damage item, a healing item, and Quicksilver is probably the best three for him. The other item I really want to highlight is Even Shroud. I think Even Shroud is particularly very good on Mordekaiser. It gives him the stats that he wants to be defensive, and also because you have melee attack damage units that's going to be circling around him the entire time. And so Even Shroud's really good to reduce that armor for the opponent, so that way you can get past that tank as soon as possible. In general, when you position this composition, you want Yone and Zed to attack the same target to try and kill as fast as they can. Zed will take any kind of leftover AD items like a Infinity Edge, a Deathblade, another Titans, BT, that kind of stuff. You can even give him Last Whisper as well, which is not actually bad at all. And that also means that you don't have to have Even Shroud on that Mordekaiser. But I will say that Even Shroud empowers like everything because it makes things like even this Viego a lot stronger, and this Kiana as well. If you're able to get 6 Crowd Diver, you usually win. I think a lot of people are going to ask, like, what if I get a Edgelord or a Heartsteel Yone? You still buy that because you really care about hitting that Yone 3 as fast as possible. Don't be too picky. If you do get a +1 Edgelord, you can, for example, cut this Kale and play like another Yorick. If you get +1 Heartsteel, then you can easily take another Heartsteel and start to farm rewards and play kind of down one Crowd Diver in the late game. And to emphasize the importance of hitting Yone 3, we recommended some augments that help you hit faster, like Heroic Grab Bag, Team Building, Prismatic Ticket, anything that really helps you reroll a lot and get that Yone 3 as fast as possible. The latest you're looking to hit this is probably like 4-2, 4-3, because you really need to spike in tempo in stage 4 before everyone else who's pushing to level 9 or rolling for their 2-star forecast get online. Early game, we recommend 2 things. One example here we have is Yasuo. Yasuo is a really good, reliable holder because he's an edgelord that connects directly to Yone's traits, and he holds the items really well. So you can go like BT Titans, Edge of Night, Quicksilver, etc., and then you can start to ladder up that accordingly. The other early game I'd also recommend would be Heartsteel. It's not something that we can list because we can't list every single early game that you can go, but if you start off with early Heartsteel and you drop an early Yone, then go for the 3 Heartsteel in the early game, lose streak, get some rewards, and then prepare for a big spike. You're going to be rolling on level 7 for this composition because you ultimately still want to get that Yone 3, and you don't want to go to 8 until you're able to get that Yone 3, because if you go to level 8, it's just going to be so much gold that you invested not into rerolling, and that also applies in general to all the 3 costs. When you're rolling for 3-cost units, you really want to roll level 7. Overall, I'm pretty sure I anticipate this comp to get nerfed in the future. And also, again, it's going to be really contested. So proceed with caution. But this composition, when it gets online, is filthy. It destroys so many different things. Another question people may have is, what happens if I'm contested? Like, what do I do? I'm too far gone. I'm in too deep. In this case, you probably level to 8 because you recognize that you can't hit Yone 3 very easily. And you pick up every Yone along the way. You don't sell any of them. And then you have units like Kiana that you hit as soon as you can to try to farm items to make Viego 2 and Z2 also help trio carry. By reducing the burden on Yone to try to carry by himself, if you have like 3 item on Yone, 3 item on Zed, 3 item on Viego, with Kiana farm those items, is a potential way that you can collect the top 4, and maybe the person who's contesting you dies, then you can roll again for the Yone 3. The other composition in S tier is a fast 9 legendary board, and it's not even really necessarily like a fast 9 anymore. It's just about playing around 5 costs, and particularly around Sona right now. Sona is the best legendary to anchor around because her attack speed is really powerful. That second option that gives your entire team buffs. It's extremely powerful, and all you really need is a Shojin and a Rage Blade. If you're able to get that onto her and buff your entire team, whether it's like Yorik's Big Ghoul and making like Ziggs cast faster, in this example we have Lucian, there's a lot of different boards that you can build. In fact, I'm going to open up this team builder and show you a little bit of like the things that you can do. So here's one example with like Lucian, for example, playing around the Jazz, which you can do. Just keep in mind that Jazz is nerfed and it's not nearly as strong, but you can easily, for example, take out this Jazz board. And so if you play like a Spellweaver because you hit a headliner Sona, for example, you can go for Spellweaver and then maybe like Jin, for example, with Shojin and GS and Deathblade, the usual good stuff. So this is like one example of like a variation you can play with that's without Jazz. You can also play around Kayn. Kayn is also a new 5 cost I want to get you guys excited about because you actually can itemize him. He's not dead weight anymore. If you do itemize around Kayn, you have an opportunity to play around Kayn and Ezreal so that you have like some AD. In this case, I would probably cut the Spellweaver. In this case, you could give items to Ezreal or Jin, and then you would tech in one more frontline unit to kind of put it all together. So in this case, it'd probably be like Thresh so that you have the Guardians. If you do end up giving items to Kayn and you're playing a setup like this, make sure you go for double healing. It's just very, very powerful. So I would say like Gunblade and Hodge, for example, could be really, really good. And then Edge of Night to just make sure that Kayn can be protected because he is a fighter unit. Legendary 9 boards, I could spend like 10, 15, 20 minutes talking about different legendary boards, but the whole point is you want to anchor around Sona, play around like Alawi, Yorick, frontline, and stuff kind, and then try to like make your backline mix and match. If people are wondering about Ziggs, Ziggs is a lot weaker of a 5 cost now, so I don't really want to give him items. He's not very reliable as much anymore. You could give him leftover AP items, though. It's not the end of the world if you do. It's just that he doesn't really carry the way he used to. Now he's purely for the utility of the hyper pop attack speed plus the dazzle effect plus the shred. My god, he actually did so much and he used to hyper carry. No wonder this unit was insane. And so that covers pretty much all the 5 costs, right? In terms of like the viability of how you can use them. Alawi to tank, Jin for the back line that ties the big shot plus Sona attack speed. Kayn is also now a viable unit to play around. Another variation that you can play, let's say you just don't want to play around Hearthstone because you're not greedy or you just don't have the setup for it, is you can just try to tech in like a late game Pentakill with Edgelords. So that way Kayn can actually shine. Let's say you're in a situation where you don't have all the items, you're not hitting all those 5 costs. Instead, you can play Viego and Kale. And so now you have Pentakill, which is really good as a team-wide buff, and you have the Edgelords. In this scenario, you have a little bit too many frontline units, so feel free to just like, move one unit back here so that we can get both these units through and have this Tentacle just be second row. But yeah, there's a lot of different variations they can play around. So I showed you a few. Definitely experiment with it. And the cool thing is 5 costs feel more balanced now. I think Sona attack speed is probably the only thing that's really out of line at the moment. So they're probably going to nerf that, and you should abuse that for LP while you can. This does bring us to an important question. How do you get to level 9, right? Like, okay, cool. If I have 200 gold, I know what to do at level 9, but how do I get there? The most important thing is to play from ahead. I think Fast 9 in its current state, I think it's inaccurate to call it Fast 9. You get to 9 with a lot of gold and a lot of HP because it's really unlikely that you're just going to get to 9, roll a few times, and hit the exact legendary to stabilize your board. So because level 8 boards are much more reliable now, it's really difficult to actually get away with a fraudulent like 5 cost 1-star board like you used to in the previous patch. And so you want to really play this from ahead from win streak. So an easy way to do it, for example, is to play, like a super fan board that, anchors around whatever headliner that you can get early. It doesn't have to be Bard. You could go ahead and just play like Corki plus Kaisa and get KDA, like the usual stuff. So just play any kind of early game plan. The second thing to consider is whether or not you can tech in different ways to get economy like Heartsteel. If you're either picking an augment like Rich Get Richer, Hedge Fund in the mid game, or you're getting stuff like Heartsteel so you can like protect your HP while also racking up a lot of economy, that's a way that you can also get to 9. But there's several different ways that you get there. So, we recommend some like leveling augments, something that incentivize you to level up like Birthday Present, or you can just take strong combat augments and just play like a really generic good play style. You're level 8, 80 HP, and you're like 50 gold, and you're like, hey, my board's actually decent. Can I go to 9 here, chances are you probably can, and you roll for like any kind of variation of the 5-cost board. And so I think it's really interesting now. I think level 9 last patch was not interesting at all, and this patch it feels like it's starting to evolve a little bit more, which I am really happy about. Also, an S tier hanging in there is Country Samira, playing around 3 costs mainly. This composition is still really strong, particularly if you hit 3 as a crowd. I mean, 3 as a crowd like turns this into like a 3.3 average comp. It's pretty disgusting. So the hit is mainly to Samira as the headliner, but we actually found out last patch that it's really late game about Vex 3 and Samira 3. It's really not about Urgot actually nearly as much. And so if you're able to get items onto Vex and to Samira 3, you can actually just straight up win the game. This is because Vex has a 1 hex AoE stun. And so whenever she shoots a target, a lot of late game boards have things like Alawi and Yorick and Thresh, right? And all those bruisers. And so they naturally just have a very clumped front line. Vex will stun all of them. And so if you position her very carefully, like put her in the middle where Samira is and the Samira in the corner, you can actually disrupt like a ton of front line. And so pay close attention to when people are putting like Thresh and Yorick next to each other alongside Echo. If you can hit all 3 of those units, you'll punish them so hard. Vex actually just takes whatever items though. I think a lot of people might be thinking like, okay, well, what's best in slot Vex? Just give her like 1 mana source and like 2 AP damage. I also really like a Gunblade on her in particular. Could be very, very good. And so definitely go for that if you can. This position is actually quite unique. The reason why we have Thresh in the corner is because Thresh will target the largest clump. And so we put him on the side so that way he can potentially hit the backline corner units. Like your opponent's corner carries like a Caitlyn or Senna. This hopefully Thresh can reach that. So feel free to play with that positioning. And you give whatever leftover items to Urgot AD. And if you can stack into Mumu 3, it also is very good. I think Set frontline is really strong as well. But the reality is Set 3 is going to be really impractical to hit because of the popularity of Heartsteel and Set in general. In fact, Set is just like one of the best 3 costs in the game right now. So I don't expect to do anything besides 2-star Set right now. Early game is pretty straightforward for a country. Usually you play this when you get like an early Samira or an Urgot out of an stage 1 orb because you have that 3 cost. So all you have to find is a Tahm Kench or a Katarina. Or alternatively, you hit a country Tahm Kench early on or a country Katarina. Outside of that, I really wouldn't force it. I also like slightly disagree. I think that you want to build your first items around Samira more than Urgot, but it kind of depends on your situation. Sometimes you need Urgot to stabilize you until you hit Samira and vice versa. I see a lot of people greeting sometimes for like perfect Samira. Remember, country is a tempo composition. You're not often going to win the lobby unless you hit something like 3's a crowd, and so you need to preserve that HP. You use that early game summon of the Hecarim Dreadsteed to get that extra stats on the board, and you try to overwhelm your opponents by having more units, and then eventually hit the 3 stars to stabilize into that very solid like 2nd, 3rd place. The one augment I want to give a shout out to is Bounty Hunters. I think this is also very, very good to farm that gold so you can get that reroll going. And also in terms of a good item off of an artifact, if you get Gold Collector, that is one of Samira's best items. Definitely go for that as well because it gives her a lot of crit damage and that execution is really, really good to farm that gold. KDA, Akali, and Ahri are in S tier still, and it's because of the role that they fill currently in the metagame. Right now, there's going to be a lot of melee carries. It's going to be those Yones and Zeds and Viegos, like, running all over those boards. And right now, Ahri is one of the few champions that can take them out very quickly. In terms of the itemization, I actually am going to the team builder to show you what I prefer right now. Blue buff and Nash's Tooth and Gunblade, I think, is like the ultimate combo that you can get on her because she has so much damage from the KDA stats. So you don't really need things nearly as much like, raw AP. And then you can also get a lot of attack speed with this blue buff to cast very often. It sounds kind of weird, right? Like, why would you want blue buff and Nash's Tooth, which it feels like both of them are like mana generating items in some ways. But in reality, they combo so well together on Ahri, who has a low mana cast threshold. So she's going to be casting often. And then she's going to be able to sustain units like the Akali. I do really like red buff on Akali. And then in reality, you can just give her like whatever items left over. It's really actually more important to have Ahri items plus like these tank items for Echo and Nico. Try to have Ahri onto unsuspecting melee carries that people are just leaving in the front row. If people have like, Viego or Yone and they're not paying attention, just put the Ahri literally right in front of them. So that way, if their unit's right here, just, make sure Ahri's like right here so they can isolate that. The second way you can kind of position Ahri is also to take out tanks. This is if you have like a damage itemization. So let's say you have, I don't know, so like a Giant Slayer instead of a Gunblade because you couldn't find a Gunblade. You can have her, hit the main tank and take it out very quickly so that way your team can snowball. Because remember, Ahri is burst oriented. You're not trying to spend all your big damage on like tentacles and whatnot. Make sure you avoid the target dummies and tentacles when you're positioned at Ahri because that can be the difference of winning the fight. And then Akali is just kind of like on the wings because she generally just wants to, swipe an AoE. So it doesn't really matter. Just make sure to put her opposite side of the carry that you want to jump on. Don't ignore Echo and Nico items. Very, very important as well. I feel like you can chase this when you have any good opener around KD in particular. When you get like Evelynn as your opening headliner, you can try to play around her early, and also Kaisa as well. In the end, it's not ideal to put things like Nash's and blue buff onto a early Evelynn or even a Seraphine, but like at the same time, you just want to kind of play whatever you get. In fact, sometimes I even might, transfer items to like a Katarina too instead. Basically play that Katarina until I hit like level 7. And then you play around this 5 KDA core with Superfan, which is kind of the staple that a lot of people know how to play around at this time. I do want to say that one thing you have to be careful about is not having Evelynn too close to the front line in the mid game. Like the positioning here is just kind of, showing you some generic ways to approach it. But Evelynn is a little bit on the fragile side, so you don't want her to get targeted by enemy carries. Like if someone has like a early Senna or something like that, she might end up dying too quickly. Oh, also, as they said, always just your position to KDA hex. You can really play this with any kind of augment setup for the most part. I think Infusion is pretty solid, and also just like, these crit things make a lot of sense. Ooh, actually, I really like the suggestion of starter kit as well. Some people who are always wondering like, okay, why do you have like one version of the build versus others? You can always click things like alternative and show like exactly what we're talking about, like the different ways that you can build all these different champions. We suggest like a couple different things because we don't want to make you feel like you always have to force the BAS items, but at the same time, recognizing that there's probably some other variations to play. Another thing I really like about this comp is I think it's really cheap comp to actually go to level 9 with if you are really far ahead. So let's say you hit this comp, right? Let's say you go to 8, you roll once, you hit, Headliner, Akali, and then you hit RE2, and you still have your core Superfan. You're like, okay, what am I supposed to do from here? So let's just roll for RE3 or, what am I supposed to do? I think in this situation, you can actually just go to 9 and then go for that Senna board that we talked about. For this very reason, that's why this alternative shows you Shojin, even though it's worse on Ahri in particular, it's better in the late game on almost everybody else. So if you have like a Shojin Nasher setup instead of a blue buff Nasher setup, you can actually like, leverage that and go into Sona at level 9, sell the Ahri and Akali, and then play for like Yorick, Sona, Kiana, and Kayn, all these other different units that can utilize a combination of the items. And so I would recommend if you are trying to learn one comp, I would actually recommend this comp as a stable way to play your early mid game. And then late game, if you are alive and you have a lot of gold, try to get to 9 and try to learn how to build a legendary board based off of this core unit. I think this is very, very good. And the cool thing is you're pretty much going to sell everything except for maybe Echo. None of these units really stay. So if you get to 9, just slowly but surely pick apart that board, sell units that don't really need, and start putting in those 5 costs that you upgrade. A tier is really thick, so let's go ahead and get through it as fast as we can. Let's start off with Yasuo. Yasuo was a comp that was actually terrorizing PBE because he was crazy bug. He was like double scaling and he was like executing more than he should be and also getting like all these crazy bonuses. So they nerfed him a lot on PBE and he wasn't really seen on live. Now he's kind of back. If you get an early headliner Yasuo, you should definitely consider rerolling him. He's particularly really good with the true damage aspect and not really the edgelords. I think a big mistake that people will make is try to go for like an edgelord variation of like building up like 5-7 edgelord. But in reality, it's true damage as a trait that's really, really good. In fact, I'm just going to spoil it. The next couple of A comps I'm going to talk about are also true damage variation. True damage is a really good tree for you to study and learn if you want to play slightly off meta, but also really strong enough to even cap out and win lobbies if everything falls into place. But for the most part, you're going to be farming a lot of top 4s with true damage in particular. Yasuo headliner really likes to have Edge of Night because he needs to be protected to stop being targeted. And you want to put things like Infinity Edge and Hand of Justice so you can have maximum damage and maximum crit potential. So that way, when he tries to go for his execute, you can get that guarantee and able to continue to stack that AD. You want to slow roll on 5. So a lot of times you're going to be rolling for like these 4 units plus 1. Doesn't really matter who it is as long as you get like an edgelord in. Don't level up early. It's really, really important that you rack up your economy and loot streak as much as you can. And then when you hit Yasuo 3, then you start pushing levels and just start adding in every single true damage you possibly can. The second thing you want to focus on is Echo item because Echo is the reliable tank that you really need to stall out. And you don't have to go for necessarily just Warmogs and Steadfast Heart. You can go for things like Crown Guard, you can go for like Bramble Declaw. It's all up in the air. Once you start getting 6 tree damage online and you find yourself with extra items, if you can get Kiana, that's great. But otherwise, I recommend itemizing Akali, which I'll talk about later on in this video. And then in terms of like augments that you're thinking about, the best augment to pay attention to without a doubt is Blinked Out. In the previous patch, if you took That's Jazz Baby, you would like take that and try to force either Misfortune as a primary carry and maybe Bard. This is kind of the same thing. You take Blinked Out, you're probably gonna look for Yasuo or maybe a Senna carry and then use this to go over the top. Some alternatives, you can also go like BT Titans and like go for this setup, but I think it is worse. Personally, I want Damage Yasuo. And again, I think Titan's Resolve is a okay item right now. It's like a generic item, Jack of all trades, but Master of none. I'd rather even go for like, Bloodthirster, Hodge, and Edge of Night instead of like a Titans, but we'll see. I mean, maybe the patch will develop and we'll find more use of it. Don't forget about anti-heal. I do think that a lot of people are so focused on like the damage and all this other stuff and that they're forgetting that you kind of need to get past tanks that can heal a lot. So make sure Yasuo does not get stuck on tanks. And then in terms of positioning, you might notice that, for example, Yasuo is on the same side as the Senna. Does want to target the same thing because you want to burst past and try to get that edgelord to scale up the attack speed and then get to the backline as soon as possible. Very, very solid comp, very annoying to deal with. Yasuo reroll is back. All right, and on that note, I mentioned Senna is the other another true damage rule that you want to consider, and it's very similar. In this case, you're going to be playing around super fans, not the edgelords, as the secondary traits. And then you can kind of flex whatever you want. A lot of times people play around Akali as a secondary, but feel free to play around whoever you get. Maybe get like a Caitlyn. I think I've seen Caitlyn carry alongside Senna. That's also very, very good. So you have a lot of options at your disposal. We did mention that Blinged Out is like a really powerful augment. One thing I didn't talk about is how good true damage is with cybernetics. True damage works by activating the bling bonus, meaning that if you put an item component onto any of the champions, they get an additional buff, kind of like a cyber. So for that reason, if you get extra item components like buried treasures, caretakers chosen, like that kind of stuff that gives you extra components, even an item grab bag can be pretty good. And also for that very reason, if you get like cybernetics, like cybernetic uplink, cybernetic bulk, it's also really good. Early game is actually pretty straightforward. You might be thinking, okay, how do I decide between Yasuo versus Senna? A lot of times it could be as simple as I have AP items like tears and rods, I'm going to play Senna. If I have AD items and a lot of gloves, I'm probably going to play Yasuo. That is likely a way that you can divide up in your mind. The other could be that you are playing like a super fan early, like maybe not even necessarily trying to play around Senna, but you say I'm Shojin and you're playing around like super fans, like forget this Yasuo. And then all of a sudden a Senna headliner shows up. You can choose to play around that and then just roll for like a Yasuo later or whatever true damage you can really get. So in fact, actually, you can look at this mid game plan, for example, and that kind of describes to you exactly why this composition is pretty strong, because you could just play this core and then get to 8 and then play something else, right? You can play like Karthus and Ahri and other AP units and just have Senna be the item holder, or you get like a ton of Senna units and then you're like, okay, I'm just going to go for all of the true damage and reroll Senna. And that's what makes it so strong. You have options. You have flexibility to your game plan. So be dynamic. Like don't necessarily think, okay, I have to play Senna. I have a headliner Senna. If it's not happening and you're win streaking with a bunch of gold and you have like, you see get 2 other people in the lobby have headliner Senna, don't force the issue. Just use this to push level. But at the same time, let's say you're like, you're just collecting a bunch of Sennas all of a sudden and you have like 5 echoes, you notice echo's not contested. Yeah, Senna 3, echo 3 is very, very good. I like that the additional comp tip shows that position Kiana in front of the enemy tank. That's really, really important when you're able to get those Kianas online to get those items. You can also reposition Senna to try to get the max amount of pulse value as well. Remember that her pulses get bigger as her headliner effect. So you want her to try to target close to the center, because if she's targeting towards the edge, you get that 1.5 hex radius while you're not hitting anything on the right. So you actually do have options of moving Senna around the back line. You don't have to corner her all the time. Best items for her are things like Shojin plus AP. Shojin Nash is actually a really good combination, but I also personally just like straight up like death cap on her. I think that's also really good because she's doing true damage. You just want to give her that raw base stats so that you amplify it a lot. And then for Akali, her best slot items are always going to be something like Edge of Night to protect her, because she doesn't have the dash from the KDA variation to keep her safe. So you want to have Edge of Night plus Hodge and maybe like Infinity Edge or Giant Slayer. I actually really like this variation. I think Infinity Edge is actually a little bit overrated on Akali in general, because I just think that she really likes the raw stats. So if you don't have Giant Slayer, I actually recommend a Deathblade here. If you also have a healing augment, let's say you have like Harm Assist and Healing Orbs, you can actually justify putting like straight up AD on Akali, like Edge of Night, Giant Slayer, and Deathblade. So that's Yasuo reroll, that's Senna reroll. Let's just go ahead and talk about True Damage Flex. True Damage Flex is a really interesting concept because you can actually just kind of play it in a ton of different variations. You pretty much just play around like these 5 core units. You can even just remove these items onto Senna, and then you can play anything around it. So, for example, you could just go ahead and tie in like Mordekaiser for a Sentinel, and instead you can actually just go straight into like a Karthus and another Pentakill unit, like of any kind. Let's say you find a Yorick, and all of a sudden now you have options, right? Like you can cut this Caitlyn because you're not having itemized on the Senna, and now all of a sudden your 7 to 8 option has a lot of power to it. Another big reason why I think it's really powerful is because I think True Damage Emblem is really strong. If you're a person that loves to chase the emblem off Carousel, True Damage absolutely needs to be one of the things to think about. Karthus, for example, can be really good if you have the mana items. In this case, I'd give him like, Shojin and like Death Cap, so that way he can hit really hard. But let's say, for example, you're not playing around Karthus and instead you're playing around Viego. Let's say you hit a headliner Viego and you really want to play him and you have an Akali too. Do the same exact thing. True damage on him and then go for, say, like Edge of Night plus a Hodge. And then all of a sudden this Viego is going to be really, really threatening as well. In this variation, for example, you would go for 6 true damage and look for the Yasuo with the edgelord. And in this case, instead of playing this Yorick, you just probably play the Kale. And now all of a sudden you have 6 true damage and 3 pentakill. And so it's very flexible. I could go on and on actually about it. Another unit, for example, you could play is like Zed and play around the Crowd Diver. You could play around true damage Caitlyn and play around the Rapid Fire. It's so open-ended that you really just got to try it out for yourself. So basically, the way you think about it is, what are some of the synergies that tie in with my carries and I can make them stronger? So in this case, any Executioner, it would be a good candidate for it. Any 5 cost that's 2-star like Keen with an edgelord would also be good with it. The list goes on and on. So true damage emblem is very, very open-ended, and that's why I definitely want to include in the A tier. It's just hard to kind of make a comp guide for it because there's so many different variations that it's hard to recommend. So just play around whatever you get and chase down those spatulas. Katarina is still a really strong reroll composition in that A tier and is kind of the younger cousin of the Yone reroll right now. Katarina had her time in the sun, but now she is weaker because the headliner effect got nerfed on the patch. And so this is a different way you can play crowd divers. It's kind of hard to pull off though because Yone is contested, and for the other Yone rerollers that might be contesting things like your Katarina, that might be a little bit tough. And also some people who play country. This is another way that you could play if you are like opening up Yone and you're like, hey, can I play Yone? And you have different reasons to play Yone, and then all of a sudden you realize that you have a better Katarina spot. You might be able to go for that. But in general, this is like a little bit of a high roll comp. Like I wouldn't really pursue it unless the game was feeding it to me, because it just feels like so many things that fall in place. You have to get the crowd diver variation of Katarina in particular. So I would suggest that you try to play this on the multi-talented portal, which gives you 2 traits instead of 1 that are headlined. So that's like a situation where I'll play Katarina instead. And another would be like if the game's just feeding me a lot of Katarinas and I'm carrying Katarina already. So, there's a situation where, for example, you play crowd diver Katarina as an item holder, which is still really good. And then all of a sudden you get 4 or 5 Katarinas. You recognize that there's other people rerolling 2 costs like Senna. You're like, okay, maybe I have an opportunity to play around Katarina because other people are rerolling 2 costs, pulls them out of the pool, gives me an opportunity to play Katarina really easily. Still very strong, and you kind of need to get 6 crowd diver. This is the contrast to Yone reroll that makes it really difficult for me to want to play it and stops it from going to S tier, is that Yone reroll doesn't necessarily need 6 crowd diver to win. This composition, I think, does. I think Katarina cannot do it by herself, and so you just need to have a 2-star Zed and you need to hit Kiana, which is very, very hard to do. But if you're able to get that, it is very, very strong in high cap. Best in slot items for her are usually a Jewel Gauntlet and a Hand of Justice, and the second Hand of Justice is through the Superfan. Alternatively, you can go for a Shojin or just raw AP on her if you want, so you can get maximum burst. But Katarina just has so much bonus damage that you want to amplify that with the crit. Another variation that people like to think about is if they want to play around country units. You totally can if you want. It's just weaker. If you want to play like 5 country, 4 crowd diver, you can. I just want to warn you that don't be disappointed if you just land like 4th place, because I feel like that's what ends up happening a lot of times with this composition. Positioning with Katarina, just make sure that she's close to the enemy carry side. You generally want Katarina to be targeting on the same side as the enemy carry, so that way her daggers can bounce and potentially snipe them. If you leave her generically in the center too often, you can get punished. Also keep in mind one thing that I actually didn't mention the Yone portion is that crowd divers jump to the farthest unit when they die. And so let's say you have this Katarina over to the right side. You want to have like a couple of other crowd divers here on the left side, so that way they die to the top right and hopefully stun the unit that could target Katarina. I really like the reroll augments they suggested here. I think it's a really good call out. I also do think March of Progress is pretty underrated for 2-cost reroll. I think a lot of people take March of Progress and think about 3 costs and maybe like 3-star 4 costs, but I do think it's interesting and worth considering if you get March of Progress, because you can start rolling early. So Akali Karthus is still alive for the Pentakill version, and I'm gonna really lean on the fact that I think Mordekaiser is actually secretly the star, like we talked about previously. Mordekaiser 3 is actually a really strong win condition. So you know what? Let's go ahead and revise this and say it's Akali / Karthus / Mordekaiser, and you try to chase them as all variations of your win condition. If you get Mord 3, sometimes I've seen people win with like Mord 3, Karthus 2, and Akali 1, and I think that's totally fine. Because if you get Yorick, you're in a really good spot. And you should play Superfan on the Mordekaiser ideally. That's why he gets Crown Guard, and you can go for something like BT Titans, or you can go like Warmog, Steadfast Heart. You can go for like Adaptive plus another defensive item. It's a lot of different ways you can itemize Mordekaiser. But if you're in a situation where you don't get headline of Mordekaiser and you get instead like Akali, you totally can just play for a fast 8 style and play Akali Karthus. I think the trade-off is the flexibility of your options is really good, but the power level of this comp is a lot lower. I've yet to really see this composition win on the patch. I think it gets a lot of top 3s and 4s. Not really many seconds though. Some people will probably argue that this is B tier, but I think the flexibility and the power of things like Pentakill Emblem, that's what can push it back into A tier and do some real good work. Also, you might be wondering if you can play PS4 Superfan, you totally can. You can play a Kennen, for example, here, and you have a lot of different options in your early mid game. Try to play around Olaf in your early game and try to make sure that Olaf is protected. I think a lot of times people put Olaf like the front center and he just takes aggro because like, oh, he gets stronger if he gets weaker. You actually want him to be a little bit protected because, you know, Olaf's a delicate flower. He must be protected. Also because Olaf is really good in overtime. So if you can find a way to even stall out, overtime is a win condition for Olaf to actually win. The thing about this comp is I think you do want to roll a 6 because you do want to end up hitting things like Mordekaiser 2 either through a headliner or you want to hit like these other super fan units because they're hard to collect later on. Rolling at 7 is really difficult to pull off in this comp unless you're chasing exclusively Mordekaiser 3 and don't really care about like Akali and Karthus. That's a different scenario and a little bit on the rare side. I think almost always, this is actually one of the exceptions. I think you want to go to 8 so you can hit everything because the odds for the 4 costs are really high compared to being at level 7 where you only have 10% odds. I also think this is a comp that can use some unusual augments like Do It For The Fans and Metalheads. I do think those are a little bit unusual that you try and experiment with. But again, this composition, we labeled it S. I'm actually kind of down to move it down to A. I'll probably message the Mobile X team about that and keep an eye on it because I will say that a lot of people are moving the stonks down on this comp. But don't forget, Pentakill emblem, really good. Still one of the best late game emblems you could possibly have and really, really powerful. Other thing I do want to say about this actually is that Viego's a better unit. So if you don't have like Akali, you totally can actually just cut this Akali and just put items on Viego instead and try to play another execution of some kind that has utility like Vex. Annie reroll is surprisingly still pretty decent, even though they changed her superfan item from a Shojin to a Jewel Gauntlet, which is a lot worse. But I still see her actually fight for tempo, and I think it's because if you can get to Sona, it's actually really good. Sona's just so busted that it almost single-handedly makes Annie viable because you're likely to play this Annie and reroll her and then get to level 8, maybe spike a Sona, or if you're able to push to 9 because you're so far ahead tempo, you can find that Sona and then put your Spellweavers over the top. This composition does have a little bit of flexibility with whether or not you hit Emo or Spellweaver, but I prefer Spellweaver instead. And also, it's really tempo dependent. I wouldn't actually say that while you are lose streaking early, you really need to spike on stage 3. If you are like rolling very slow for Annie, like, hey, I'm going to like roll above 50 gold and I'm only going to roll like 3 or 4 times. And if I hit Annie, great. If I don't, oh well. And then you like win, lose, win, or even worse, you just lose. You're going to actually be in a kind of a bad spot. You actually really need to hit Annie because you need to spike stage 3 to get momentum and preserve that HP and then carry that momentum to get to level 8. Getting to 5 to level 8 without rolling a single time is really difficult, and usually it requires you to spike on stage 3. So keep that in mind and roll hard at 3-1 for those Annie's 3s. And for that very reason, I actually wouldn't really pick this up unless I have a lot of Annie's early on, or you get something that kind of makes like a little bit too much sense, like, you know, like learning the spell actually is a really good scaling augment for Annie, but at the same time, I think it's like a little bit on the sketch side unless you have a lot of Annie's. I wouldn't pick that augment, for example, unless I had like an Annie 2 immediately, and then I am trying to force that Annie headliner. Mid-game plan is pretty straightforward. You just level up and play around Amumu. He's a really solid emo guardian to tech in here, and don't mind that you have like 3 guardians. It looks awkward, but it's worth it. Trust me, Amumu's that good. Positioning wise can just be pretty generic. Just remember one thing: if you play Lulu, you want to have hyper pop buffing Annie and not any other units. Sometimes people put Lulu like in the bottom center and it buffs like Annie and maybe like Kennen. Just make sure she's buffing the right units. And overall, it's still like okay. Remember, the goal is to get to Sona and replace some of these units with Sona and just get Sona on the board. Yeah, with Rageblade Shojin. More Sona, more win. So MF reroll is a lot weaker because they nerfed Jazz and they nerfed MF headliner. But I will say that it actually works in the favor of the comp because now it's like less contested, and also because people are playing less Jazz on late game boards, it feels like you can actually hit this comp. And so now it's actually kind of like not S, but like, you know, it's actually reasonable comp to hit, especially if you end up getting that's Jazz baby. I know that like it was ridiculous stats and it got nerfed like a lot, but like you have to remember one thing: this augment was like busted. Like who greenlit that's Jazz baby on the previous patch? This patch, it's actually like reasonable if you're uncontested and you can hit all this. And so if you can hit MF and get the usual stuff like Rageblade and Last Whisper, and then get the Superfan item on Deathblade, it's really good still. If you're able to hit like even early, you might be able to even cap out and do the usual thing of adding legendaries at the late stages of the game and then win out from there. So I actually have seen this comp do okay since the patch launched. Play around early game Big Shot. Corki is a fantastic item holder if you have him as a headliner, really, really strong, and have him hold the item. And then if you're able to get the Superfan in the mid game with the Jazz, you already know. You get 5 synergies active active on level 6, it's kind of gross. And then if you hit an Echo, it's just gross. The best headliner that you can hit is the Jazz, so that you get like the +1 Jazz trait. You don't really want the +1 big shot because you already have this Kai'Sa. It does make it a little bit inconvenient, but if you do hit that +1 Kai'Sa, you can play for 4 big shot as well. Love reroll augments in this. I do think that shopping spree, prismatic ticket, that all makes sense. Bigger shot, I will say, after reevaluating it, it got nerfed so hard that you might want to reconsider picking it because the stats on it are a lot worse. Another thing to consider is that people, when they're chasing for MF, they think they have to itemize Bard a lot. In reality, you actually need to itemize your front line because you actually need the Echo and the Nico to stall for as long as you can. So I would say go for MF item, then build Echo items, then give whatever leftover tank items to Nico and whatever AP items to Bard. And that's a priority. So that's pretty much it. It's a composition I think a lot of people are familiar with. You played this a lot the last patch. Jazz MF, still okay and solid if you are uncontested and the conditions are right. Otherwise, I'd probably just play this into a fast 8, try to play around Ezreal instead, which I'm about to talk about in a second here. So Ezreal is a very solid AD carry. He's the premier AD backline carry right now. I actually think he's even better than Jhin to an extent because of how versatile he is, and particularly because how good Heartsteel is at the moment. This board that I'm recommending is just an example board. The actual piece that you need for Ezreal is Ezreal, another big shot, and then a front line. That's it. You can actually play like anything with it. In fact, let's go ahead and just open up this team builder and I'll show you what I mean. So let's say you hit a big shot Ezreal. You can actually just cut both of these and you don't need 2 big shots, and you also don't need 2 sentinels. So you can cut like Mordekaiser and Cassante, and you can just play like, around this unit, and then you can play like whatever you want. So for example, last patch, some people experimented with like Disco, and they played Twisted Fate plus Gragas, and they got the Disco here, and then they play some Heartsteel units that kind of combine with it, like Set for the Bruiser that connects to the Gragas, and then Cassante for the Sentinel so that you could connect to it. And like this was like a variation that some people played last patch. So we had the Heartsteel and the Disco, and in this case, you also can tag in Jazz as you start to notice that there's a lot of traits active. Misfortune for the big shot, Bard for the Jazz, and yeah, all of a sudden, look what you got. You got like a large synergy list, and you got Heartsteel Disco. That's one way you can play Ezreal. Let's go back to the drawing board. Let's say you hit an Akali with true damage, and you're able to get items onto her. Edge of Night plus like Deathblade. I don't know, because you're just swimming in the 80 items. Get a big Heartsteel cash out, make that happen. Now all of a sudden you just have to tie in the rest of the synergy that makes sense. So in this case, you can go for a Mumu and Vex. So you have Emo, and you have the execution that ties in, and then now you just need a Guardian. Let's Tekken back that Thresh, and voila, you have a comp that should be able to get to level 9 as well. Okay, we're going back to the core of like the big shot sentinels. Maybe you hit a Poppy too. Maybe you can play around that. Guess who's another Masha that ties in really nicely with Ezreal? Oh, it's a Set. And also we have another Bruiser. Maybe go like Zac. And now we have like a really good front line, and you have Warmog and Sterix go to Poppy, and then you give Sterix Gauge to Poppy, and all of a sudden now you have Poppy carry alongside Ezreal, and maybe you want to take another Heartsteel unit so that way you feel like you can farm some gold. You have Aphelios, and who's also a good rapid fire and true damage that can tie it in? It's Senna. And so this is another way you can play Ezreal Flex. Ezreal Flex is actually so fun to play. All you need is Ezreal 2 and a secondary frontline carry to help amplify that damage and stall for Ezreal, and just watch him carry you all the way to level 9 and play for a big cash out. And this also brings us to another point of emphasis that Heartsteel is so good. Cassante is one of the best early game units in the game, and you get the opportunity to get a lot of rewards both in the early, mid, and even late stages of the game. So think about different ways you can play Ezreal board. You don't always have to grieve for the Heartsteel cash outs. Also, you can just play Ezreal without it. You can go for 4 big shots. I would say that you want to play around Jhin if you do that. You can also, instead just play around Ezreal MF. Don't feel like you have to play around Jazz. A lot of different opportunities. So for people who like to be big brained and very flexible and play what you hit spontaneous, try Ezreal Flex. Very, very fun. If you like Ezreal Flex, then I want to introduce you to another flex that's also starting to pick up steam in the A tier, so it might actually end up becoming very good in the meta, and that's Viego and Zed Flex. This is primarily what you play if you're not going for Yone reroll because you're either contested, or maybe you just have like a Yone pair and all of a sudden you hit like Viego 2 and you have like a Zed. You can actually just go for something like this, and this is the core shell, which is you play around the Pentakill, Ezreal, and Crowd Diver, and then you just have Zed and Viego dual carry. And you can pretty much play whatever you want. So in this case, your front line's pretty bad. It's just based off Mordekaiser, and you can just go ahead and play like, Set plus Zac, and all of a sudden you have EDM in. Zac's a little better this patch. And then maybe you hit a Yorick and you're like, oh my God, I hit Yorick. I have the 3 pentakill here. You can cut this Kale and you can start to tech up into a Kayn. And then you can have like a trio carry in this spot. Very, very versatile composition, but I gotta admit, it's a little bit emerging and you're never really planning for it, if that makes sense. The best way you can plan for this comp is you slam generic AD items. Let's say you're playing like Yasuo reroll and you're like, oh my God, someone else pivoted to Yasuo reroll. What do? I can't do anything. This game sucks. No, actually, you can be like, okay, in that spot, I'm gonna try to play for like a Viego carry and then maybe like tag Zed on with it and flex around whatever I can get there because you're committed at that point. So you might notice that these items are also really good on Akali. And so, yeah, you want to keep yourself open to like 84 cost flex. That's kind of what makes this patch really interesting, in my opinion. And it's a big step in the right direction for people who love to play, open fluid TFT. This is a comp that I can't really say much more on because I think it's something that's still like developing, and probably by the middle of the patch, I'll have a lot more thoughts and laid out. But I just want to give you guys a ground framework. Remember, the core units are 3 Pentakill, 3 Edgelord, and you're primarily playing around these units and then just trying to build up a board. Just remember, try not to play too many offensive units, because if you go for like more edgelords in this situations or more crowd divers, you're going to have too much offense and not enough frontliners to stall for your damage dealers. Very, very solid comp though. The last comp I'm going to talk about today is Riven. I think Riven 8-bit has a lot of potential. 8-bit got buffed a lot, and I think the reason why this composition can be an A tier is solely because the top end of this composition is so strong. It can actually win lobbies. But as you might notice, that it has a lot of overlapping units that are really problematic to consistently get. It's going to be difficult to get Viego and Yone a lot. You might be noticing that they're just in a lot of composition, so you might not hit. And the other thing is you kind of need to hit very specific Riven items, and you need to hit Riven 3 at an early enough cadence. If you hit Riven like end of stage 4, beginning of stage 5, you are probably going to be fortunate enough to like squeeze out like a 3rd or 4th. But if you hit her early and you get like the 8-bit rolling and you're able to get the grand prize, it's really, really strong. They also buffed Live for Danger, so this augment is better now, but I'm still not entirely sold if you hit that augment, you have to force it. Instead, I'd rather prioritize things like, Prismatic Ticket, you have early Riven pair, okay, I'm going to go for it, and I have really good Riven items. Riven really wants Bloodthirster Titans and QSS, although I think you can probably get away without Titans and just go for like another AD items like Infinity Edge or Hodge. Like this kind of build also makes sense. I just think that like Riven in general really needs anti-CC, so Quicksilver is important, and you want her just to auto and like, poke and stab like a lot. She's very, very good with that. Early game is just played on Corki, and it looks weird because you're putting items on Corki that are like meant for an attack fighter, but it makes sense because he's going to ladder you to Riven. So just play around Corki. And then once you get to level 7, try to roll for the board for the most part. You can actually play around early Heartsteel as well, but I do think that HP preservation is kind of important. And so try not to play Heartsteel unless you absolutely need to. And also, if you're playing Heartsteel into something like this, you might as well actually play for a higher tier composition that have a lot more guaranteed power, like the Yone comps, or maybe go for like Viego plus Zed. There's a lot of things you can do from this position. So unless you're a really big fan of Riven, or if you get an 8-bit emblem early for some reason, that's actually very, very good on Viego in particular, I wouldn't recommend going for that. Another good user of 8-bit emblem, by the way, is Ezreal. Ezreal really likes AD in general. I didn't actually mention it previously, but Ezreal's like best items like Infinity Edge, I think. And so just giving him flat AD is just really, really strong in general. So yeah, give it a try. If you get Riven as your headliner and you're able to like have good items and you have good setup for it, a lot of AD, try to go for it. I will say that if you get Pandora's items at 2-1, that probably is good enough for you to pick, because you do really need specific items. This even shroud on Mordekaiser is also really, really important. So get these specific items going and let her rip. So there you have it. My comp list recommendations for 13.24 just get started. It's a good mix of comps, honestly. I think it's a good patch. There's simple, like straightforward comps that I think are powerful and have a lot of ways for you to scale. There's also flex compositions where people love fluid, open gameplay where you're like, okay, what do you do in these situations? Well, it depends on your augments and the situation. And then there's also some like emerging unique compositions that if the conditions line up, you end up being really, really powerful. So the next video that I'm going to do is situational off-meta comps, but when you get the right conditions for, the stars will align. I'm talking about like really weird rerolls or like augment specific things like Twin Terror. I'll show you how to play all that next video. So hope you guys keep your eyes peeled for that, and I'll see you guys next time.